It's time for me to start something I've been wanting to do for a long time. And that's to talk about my favorite story ever, and that's One Piece. And I want to go through the whole thing. Yes, the whole thing. And I know that's a tall task. It's well over 1,000 chapters and episodes, and it's a story much more layered than any Dragon Ball series I've talked about, but it's a challenge I'm excited for. So without further ado, this is my review on the greatest selling manga of all time, one of the longest running animated series ever, and in my experience, the most entertaining story ever in One Piece. Now, even people that haven't watched or read One Piece know that it's about Luffy and his pirate crew, so it's only right that we start at the beginning where we see his crew begin to take shape, back in an arc known as Romance Dawn. Romance Dawn starts before we see the Luffy we all know and love, and we actually go back before Luffy is even born. Right out the gate, we see Gold Roger's execution, and this moment told me a couple things about One Piece that will be very important to know going forward. The first is that no matter how legendary or strong someone may seem, characters in this story can die. Because we are told that Gold Roger is king of the pirates, and you would assume that title came along with a great deal of strength. Yet Roger dies, and the moment isn't given too much attention at first, but it very well could be the most important moment in the series. Roger's words before his death set off what is known as the Great Pirate Era. I'll explain later exactly what this era meant. But then we're introduced to Luffy, but as a young child, and he's interacting with Shanks and his crew. Now at first glance, they seem to be laid-back pirates who Luffy admires. Yet the deeper you get into this story, you kind of learn almost nothing happens as a coincidence. As a matter of fact, the straw hat we see Shanks wear is the one that is passed down to Luffy later in this arc. And boy, oh boy, is that straw hat important. Even Luffy eating the gum fruit seems like a funny accident, and of course, the story later reveals to us that it isn't. What I'm trying to get across is that Oda plants seeds early, and that's one of my favorite traits of his as a writer, his foreshadowing. What looks like a throwaway moment or character ends up circling back hundreds of chapters later as a crucial part of the story. Romance Dawn is full of those moments, and reading it back now, I realize how deliberate so many of these choices were. But let's finish setting up Luffy. While Luffy and Shanks are talking in a bar, the leader of some mountain bandits pulls up and he's looking to have a certain kind of drink. Unfortunately, Shanks and his crew drank all of it except for one bottle, and Shanks, trying to be nice, offered the bottle to the mountain bandit. And instead of accepting the nice gesture, the mountain bandit breaks the bottle in Shanks' face. This would be a very important moment for Luffy because he's watching all of this unfold. He looks up to Shanks, so how Shanks reacted in this moment would definitely shape how Luffy would react in a similar situation. And guess what Shanks does? Nothing. The bandits leave and call Shanks and his crew a bunch of cowards, and Luffy agrees. He just watched his role model get bullied. So Luffy storms out, but not before Shanks can grab his arm, and that's where everyone learns that he ate the gum fruit. Now if we fast forward a little bit, the bandits come back to town and Luffy tries to get payback for Shanks, but the leader does have an 8 million berry bounty, so amongst normal people, he's pretty dangerous. So Luffy, he doesn't stand a chance, and that's okay because Shanks and his crew were back. And how these next set of events play out do a great deal to contextualize the first interaction between Shanks and the bandits. One of the bandits goes up to Shanks and points a gun at his head, and Shanks tells him, "You're putting your life on the line by pointing that gun at me." And before the mountain bandit can make another move, Shanks' crewmate kills the bandit. Just like that. Now the bandits, of course they're upset, and they go on about how it isn't fair, and Shanks tells them, "We're pirates, and we don't play by the rules. You can pour your drinks on me, you can throw food at me, you can even spit on me. I'll just laugh that stuff off. But for good reason or not, nobody hurts a friend of mine." And you'll see the deeper we get into this story, those are words Luffy held closer to his heart than any other. Shanks' crew destroys the bandits, and in the chaos, the leader escapes to the sea with Luffy, and he kicks Luffy into the ocean. Eating a devil fruit is cool. You get one of 3 types of powers, and depending on which one, you almost instantly become one of the strongest people in the world. But there's one glaring downside. A devil fruit user cannot swim. So the bandit kicking Luffy into the ocean is essentially a death sentence. But before Luffy drowns, a huge sea monster appears and eats the mountain bandit and is getting ready to eat Luffy, but out of nowhere Shanks saves Luffy, stares at the monster, and tells it to go away. Shanks loses his arm in the process, but later in this arc, Luffy tells Shanks that he will be king of the pirates and an even better pirate than him. Shanks hears this and gives Luffy his straw hat and tells him to give it back to him once he becomes this great pirate. Now I can go through this interaction and break down all of the foreshadowing taking place, but I'd rather talk about how well Shanks' introduction was executed. At first, we see Shanks and his crew humiliated by a group of mountain bandits sitting there with spilled drinks and insults thrown in their faces. To a young Luffy, it feels cowardly that these pirates he looks up to just let it happen. But Oda is patient. The very next time we see Shanks with those same bandits, the crew isn't taking hits, they're handing them out. It redefined what you thought you understood about Shanks. He wasn't weak or scared, he was choosing not to fight. And then comes the real turning point. When Luffy is thrown into danger, Shanks doesn't draw a sword or unleash some grand attack. He simply stares and the creature flees in terror. That move makes it clear that Shanks is on a level far above anything we've seen so far. What makes this so effective is that Oda sets it up through contrast. By letting the audience first think that Shanks was being passive, his later show of strength becomes even more impactful. It showed that Shanks has honor, restraint, and the wisdom to know when violence matters and when it doesn't. And that restraint ends up being one of the most important lessons he passes down to Luffy. Then we see a time skip to Luffy now being 17 years old and getting ready to head out to sea for his own adventure. And he says it, the first thing he has to do is get a crew. And in this arc, Luffy recruits 4 members, Zoro, Usopp, Sanji, and Nami. So let's start with Zoro. Oh wait, hold on. Before Luffy recruits any crewmates, he meets a boy around his age named Kobe. Now Kobe isn't anyone of considerable strength and he's a coward, but after meeting Luffy and seeing his determination for becoming king of the pirates, Kobe is inspired to chase his dream in becoming a member of the Navy. It's a long shot and it seems insignificant, but for a couple chapters he follows Luffy around, and the first stop the two make is in a small town where they meet Roronoa Zoro. Zoro has been tied up for 9 days and asks Luffy to set him free, and in exchange, Luffy will get all of the money Zoro can acquire from a bounty. But before Luffy can even approach Zoro, a young girl tries to feed Zoro some food. Even with such a bad reputation, this little girl had no fear in walking to Zoro and trying to feed him. And we learn later that this is because Zoro got captured protecting her from some wild dogs. Captain Morgan and his annoying son Helmeppo capture Zoro for some nonsense, and after hearing more about his story, Luffy decides that this is the kind of guy he needs to be part of his crew. To make a long story short, Luffy frees Zoro, and the two of them go on to beat Captain Morgan and his men pretty easily. We get to see a glimpse of what Luffy is able to do with a rubber body and how Zoro wields 3 swords at the same time. Now what happens next is another great moment which highlights what I think is an underrated trait of Luffy's, and that's his emotional intelligence. He isn't book smart by any means, and if I'm being blunt, he's flat out dumb most of the time. But how he handles Kofi as they say farewell, and really for the entirety of Romance Dawn up to this point, was a treat. Luffy and Zoro have to leave town. Yes, they did save the people from Captain Morgan's tyranny, but Marines can't house pirates. So Luffy and Zoro get up to leave and Kobe stays. But one of the Marines asks Luffy if Kobe is with him, and Luffy smiles as he begins to tell Kobe's backstory and how he worked for Alvida, knowing that if the Marines figured this out, they wouldn't let Kobe join the Navy. This was Luffy testing Kobe's will, a will that had been built by his presence, and sure enough, Kobe stands up for himself and punches Luffy. Now Luffy goes on to beat up Kobe, but this display of courage showed the Marines that he wasn't a pirate, and it also showed Luffy that Kobe was serious about his dream. Maybe just as serious as Luffy was about his. Maybe this was Ichiro Oda setting up a storyline that will continue for over 1,000 episodes. Next, we head to Orange Town, and this is where we meet a couple of characters who end up being really important. First, there's Nami, and she kind of sneaks her way into the story, already running scams on pirates and stealing treasure. From her first conversation with Luffy, she makes it clear that she hates pirates, which is funny considering, who she ends up traveling with. At this point, we don't know her backstory, but the way Oda writes her, you can tell it isn't just a simple pirates are bad type of thing. There's more behind it. And even though she's reluctant to team up with Luffy, the fact that she does ends up being the start of one of the most important relationships in the series. Then there's Buggy the Clown. Now Buggy's played up for laughs. He's loud, over the top, and his whole circus theme is ridiculous, but he's also the first Devil Fruit opponent Luffy goes up against. And that matters. I don't hear people bring that up too often. Up until this point of the story, Luffy's powers have felt like this wild, unique thing that sets him apart. But Buggy's Chop Chop Fruit reminds us that Luffy isn't the only one out there with these kind of abilities. And while the fruit's powers look goofy, it can actually be dangerous in combat. Buggy isn't just someone you can dismiss as a joke villain. Well, that would actually be if he wasn't a joke himself. The reason Luffy is able to overpower an experienced pirate and devil fruit user like Buggy is because he's a coward. But getting away from Buggy, there's a moment in Orange Town that really sticks with me, and that's with the dog Cho-Cho. He's guarding his owner's pet shop, even though the owner has already passed away, but the dog does it because it's the only thing he has left. When Buggy's men come to burn it down, Cho-Cho stands his ground, and it's heartbreaking when the shop does get destroyed. But what I love is how Luffy reacts to him. He doesn't treat Cho-Cho like a side character, and he is, but this is something Luffy continuously does throughout One Piece. He shows so much care to side characters, and as a result, it makes the One Piece world feel huge because we get to see so many of these characters' stories and perspectives. Luffy respects Cho-Cho's loyalty and his will to protect what matters to him. That's huge because it shows early on that Luffy isn't just chasing treasure, but that he cares about people's dreams, no matter how insignificant they may seem. And that theme never goes away and never goes away. Orange Town is by no means a standout stop in the One Piece story, but like every stop in the One Piece story, it quietly sets up a lot of what's going to matter later. To say I'm excited to talk about One Piece would be the understatement of the century. Can't wait for you guys to get the next part. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. That being said, this is Matt and thanks for watching. Y'all have a good one.